You surely know that 70% of Earth's surface is covered by water and 97% of it is salty. Can you imagine what might be hiding in the depths of these vast territories? Even discovering one new island reveals many species and teaches us something new. So what can be said about the vast expanses of the ocean floor? What might be hiding there? My name is Everett, and I work on an oil rig in the North Sea, not far from the coast of England, at a depth of about 3,000 meters. We are engaged in oil and gas extraction. This work is complex and requires maximum care because any mistake can lead to a catastrophe. I am the operations dispatcher responsible for controlling the extraction process, technical maintenance, and personnel training. My workspace is a room with multiple screens displaying all parts of the station and the seabed, where the blowout preventer is installed. This device prevents high-pressure blowouts. If it fails, oil under high pressure can erupt. I also oversee the work of personnel and various aspects of the drilling platform's operations. About 200 people work here, including drillers, technical, and maintenance staff. The work here is continuous. We work 12-hour shifts. Every 3 weeks we return to shore, usually by boats. But in bad weather, a helicopter is sent for us. The North Sea is famous for its strong storms, which can pose a serious danger due to high wind speeds and large waves. Our floating platform is held on the surface by 2 underwater pontoons, ensuring its stability, and anchored by 4 cables stretching to the seabed, ensuring its reliable retention. The work here is very demanding, but the pay is significantly higher than on land. The main requirement is maximum concentration because any mistakes can lead to fires, explosions, or mechanical injuries. Once, when I had just started working, my experienced senior colleague overlooked the pressure in the compression hose, which burst and hit him with force. He was thrown by the impact and died on the spot. Yes, accidents happen here, so safety precautions are strictly enforced. On that day, I had just returned to the station after a 3-week shift. After taking my post, I began monitoring the cameras and noticed strange behavior from Bob, a technical employee who was in the drilling compartment and standing still. I called out to him on the radio. "Hey Bob, buddy, what's up with you?" But he didn't respond. I tried calling him again, but there was no response. So I contacted Bill, who was working nearby, and asked him to check on his colleague. On the screen, I saw Bill approach him and start shaking him. Bob seemed to be in a trance, and only after Bill shook him harder did he snap out of it and look around, not understanding what was happening. Then I called for another worker to replace him and a doctor, then asked an assistant to watch over the station and went to the medical block. It was important for me to know the employee's condition as it could seriously affect the work. When I arrived, I saw 2 doctors leaning over the patient. One was shining a flashlight in his eyes to check his reaction, while the other was examining his chart. I asked what was going on, but only saw signs of confusion on their faces, so I turned to Bob. "I don't know myself," he replied. "When I was working, I heard a banging noise. I immediately got worried and started looking for the cause, but it seemed like the noise was coming from outside. I listened, and suddenly the sound started getting closer to me, as if something was rising from the depths. It was getting closer and closer, and it seemed like the surrounding reality was dissolving. When it seemed like it was almost reaching me, I suddenly woke up. Honestly, it scared me. It was like some kind of primal fear. I wanted to run but couldn't move, as if something had caught me like a spider in its web." Listening to his story, I couldn't believe his words. Nodding as if understanding him, I patted him on the shoulder, then called the head doctor and asked to check Bob for drugs. It was also worth considering the possibility of a mental disorder. Overall, the situation looked strange. Fortunately, we had a replacement worker, but I still needed to report what was happening to the base. Saying goodbye, I asked Bob to stay in the infirmary for observation and expressed hope that he would be fine tomorrow. Then I returned to the observation room and contacted the shore base. From there, I was advised to wait, and they said they would send a replacement if necessary. When my shift ended, I headed to the drilling compartment and asked the workers if they had heard any suspicious banging, but they just shook their heads. Then I inspected the place where Bob had worked and listened carefully, but heard nothing. After all, it was related to Bob himself, I concluded, and went on vacation. The next day, there was a calm at sea, a rarity for this area. Stepping out onto the platform, I looked around. A fog was slowly thickening, becoming denser with each passing minute. This caused me concern because in all my time working here, I had never encountered anything like it. Other workers also came out to see what was happening, looking around in surprise and whispering to each other. Such a phenomenon would be more typical for a small lake, not the turbulent North Sea. After standing for some time, I ordered everyone to disperse and get to work. The morning passed without incident. During lunch, I planned to check on Bob's condition. Just as I was about to get up, my assistant Henry noticed something strange on the underwater camera. It was camera number 23, installed on the blowout preventer and aimed at the seabed around it. Henry pointed to an area of the seabed where it seemed like something was hitting the bottom, causing bits of earth and rocks to float up, along with bubbles. "What is this?" I asked in surprise. Could it be a blowout? But the sensors showed that the pressure was normal and hadn't changed even slightly. Then what is it? Maybe some kind of fish? But the hits were rhythmic, as if someone was playing drums. I watched this strange phenomenon for a while, then headed to the infirmary to check on Bob. Arriving there, I saw doctors bustling around someone. Soon I saw the patient lying on the bed, clutching his ears and screaming loudly. The doctors tried to calm him down, but he didn't respond and continued to thrash and scream. I rushed to help the doctors and held Bob's shoulder while one of the doctors administered a sedative. After some time, Bob fell asleep. We gently laid him on the bed and covered him with a blanket. Then I asked the doctors what had happened. They explained that everything was normal until lunch. He had gotten up early and said he was feeling fine. However, then his face suddenly took on a frightened look. Apparently, he heard the banging again. He jumped up and began pacing around the infirmary, listening to something. Suddenly, he screamed and grabbed his ears. We asked him to describe the pain, but he didn't respond. The situation was escalating, so I contacted the base, explained what had happened, and asked them to send a helicopter. Bob needed to be taken ashore as soon as possible. However, I was refused, as they said that due to the dense fog in the platform area, movement was impossible. That fog again, I thought. All right, nothing to be done, we'll have to wait. Gathering my thoughts, I returned to work. Henry continued to monitor camera number 23. I approached him and reminded him not to forget to monitor the entire station. He seemed to snap out of it, scratched his head, and apologized. My shift was coming to an end, and all this time I couldn't stop thinking about this phenomenon. This mystery wouldn't leave my mind. By the end of the shift, Henry was again glued to screen 23. We noticed that a rectangular trench had formed on the seabed, as if something had been buried there and it was trying to break free. We recorded this phenomenon and sent the recording to the base for analysis. The next morning, I went out to the observation deck early. The sea was calm and the fog seemed even thicker. Coming to the observation post, I saw that Henry was already there. 3 men were staring at the monitor. I immediately understood that it was camera 23. Looking at the screen, I noticed a rectangular pit on the seabed. Whatever it was, it had surfaced. I started asking my colleagues if they had seen what it was, but they shook their heads. So I sat down at my desk and started looking for the folder with the recordings. Finding the right file, I pressed the play button and started looking for the right moment. After a while, Henry exclaimed, "There it is, rewind." I did, and saw how a coffin with beautiful carvings and patterns suddenly burst out of the ground with the last blow. It floated to the surface. We watched this scene in shock. Henry, being a very religious person, began to recite prayers. I also searched for an explanation in my mind. However, pulling myself together, I thought that since the object had surfaced, there was no need to worry about it. Closing the recording, I got back to work. But the calm didn't last long. I noticed on one of the cameras that the doctors were running around the platform in a frenzy. I had to go out and find out what was happening. On the way, I met one of the doctors who, breathing heavily, told me that Bob was missing. Tension reached its peak when we called in additional forces to search. I radioed Henry and asked him to check the surveillance footage. After half an hour of searching, we found no traces, but then I heard Henry's worried voice over the radio, urgently inviting me to the observation point. Arriving there, I found that the station chief, Mr. Blackwood, was already there. They were carefully studying the camera recordings. On the screen, the infirmary appeared first, where Bob lay on the bed. Suddenly, he sat up sharply, shocking me so much that I took a step back. Then Bob got up and quickly headed for the exit. The camera switched, and we saw him walking down the corridor and out onto the street. The next image showed the outside of the platform, where Bob suddenly ran and jumped into the sea. I wanted to shout at him to stop, realizing that it was already too late. This action evoked a wave of emotions in me. We stood, digesting what we saw, until Mr. Blackwood ordered a lifeboat to be lowered and the search for the body to begin, although the chances of finding him were slim. Surviving in these icy waters was almost impossible. As expected, the search yielded no results. Rumors began to circulate around the station. As I passed by the dining room, I saw everyone whispering and discussing the situation. And I didn't blame them. In the last few days, indeed, a lot of strange things had happened. I couldn't sleep at night, and when I finally managed to fall asleep, I saw something terrifying. I walked through the station, which was surprisingly empty. There were no people here. I walked, inspecting the rooms and calling out to someone, but no one responded. Then I went up to the main platform, where we often held meetings. There I saw a man standing on the edge of the platform, looking at the sea. The wind played with his hair, and his posture exuded some kind of majesty. He was dressed in strange clothes, reminiscent of the attire of Romans that I had seen in movies and books. As I approached, he turned around. I noticed a golden crown on his head, encrusted with diamonds in the shape of a star. His face was pleasant, I would even say beautiful. A straight pointed nose, high cheekbones, eyes of a dark red color. Wait. Why did he have red eyes? I thought to myself. But before I could reflect on it, he raised his hand, pointing at something behind me. When I turned around, I froze in shock. There were bodies scattered all over the platform. They were all dressed in our company's uniforms, but it was hard to tell who was who, as they all seemed shriveled. Here I saw a tag with Bob's name on one of the forms. From his empty eye socket crawled a disgusting creature resembling a centipede, but it had a head with a large round mouth filled with small sharp teeth. Suddenly it began crawling towards me. I was frightened and started backing away, and it accelerated too. Then I turned around and tried to run, but saw that a horrifying creature stood in place of the man. He was dressed in the same attire, but his face resembled that of a terrifying demon with dark red skin, sharp fangs, a flat nose, and pointed ears. Behind him were bat-like wings. Suddenly he bared his teeth and spread his wings, flying towards me. I was horrified and ran to the left. Looking back, I realized that these creatures were following me. I ran with all my might, but it seemed they were about to catch up. But suddenly, ahead I saw an old man standing at the door, also dressed in ancient clothing. Could he also be a monster? But he waved his hand, inviting me to come inside. I didn't have much of a choice, so I followed him. He locked the door and there was a loud knock. Then another one. I feared they would break down the door, but the old man remained calm. He headed into the dark corridor, as if asking me to follow, but I hesitated. I looked back and saw the trembling door. The creature was fiercely trying to break through. I had to follow the old man, I thought, but when I turned around, he was gone. I heard the loud knock again, like the clang of metal against metal, and I woke up. I lay in bed, trying to regain my senses, wondering about that strange dream. Someone persistently knocked on the door of the room. I got up and opened it, seeing Henry with a concerned expression. Before I could ask what was happening, I heard a loud ringing, the same one from my dream. What was that? I looked at my colleague in surprise. He just shrugged. I got dressed, and we went outside. Many people had gathered, awakened by the noise. Everyone looked around fearfully, trying to find the source of the sound. It was beginning to dawn, but the dense fog obscured the view. Suddenly, someone shouted that the noise was coming from below the platform where the pillars stood. We craned our necks and saw something dark beating against one of the pillars. But what was strange was that the sea was calm, with no waves, yet this thing beat rhythmically. Soon the boss came out and ordered a lifeboat to be lowered. I volunteered to help. When we got to the sea, we immediately headed towards the thing. As we approached, I realized what it was. How did I not figure it out immediately? Floating on the water was that same iron coffin, chained up. Waves were hitting it against the pillar. It was a strange sight. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. Contacting via radio, we reported the situation. Mr. Blackwood then ordered the coffin to be brought up. I was against it, feeling a bad vibe, but I didn't argue. Soon ropes were lowered, and we secured the coffin before lifting it up. When we returned, some of the workers began sawing the chains. I wanted to stop them, but didn't know what argument to use. If I said I had a bad feeling, this group of workers and engineers would look at me like I was crazy. Although I noticed that some people, those who were particularly superstitious, weren't too happy about what was happening. The boss stood by the coffin, ordering this or that chain to be cut, as if he were on a production line. Soon the last link was cut, and the chains fell to the ground with a clang. When this happened, I felt a slight wave. Was it just me? I looked around, but the faces of those around me seemed unchanged. We surrounded the coffin, examining the carvings and inscriptions on it. The boss searched for a tool to help open it. Finally finding it, he cleaned it of rust and pulled. My heart was racing. What awaited us inside? It didn't budge at first, so a few more people joined in, and the coffin lid opened. I expected some kind of monster to jump out, but it was empty inside. What? Everyone looked puzzled at the empty coffin, hoping to see at least a corpse or some treasure. But it was empty. Mr. Blackwood ordered it to be taken to the hangar, as it might be of interest to archaeologists and historians. The workers discussed what had happened and began to disperse. I blamed myself for being cowardly and overly cautious. then returned to my room. The day passed without incident. The base was informed of Bob's death and the discovery. The helicopter still couldn't fly due to the fog. This whole situation made me feel isolated. I decided to distract myself and not dwell on the bad, but the dream I had kept resurfacing in my mind. As the shift neared its end, I noticed something had happened on one of the cameras. It was the storage room. Contacting via radio, I asked what was going on. I was told that a body had been found there. Someone else died. I rushed over, and when I arrived, I saw a crowd of people. Familiar doctors were bent over something resembling a human. When I got closer, I saw a body lying on the floor, leaning against the wall. But the most horrifying thing that made my hair stand on end was that the body was dried up, as if all the water had been drained from it. Just like I saw in my dream. I felt a weakness and horror that made it hard for me to move. The people around me also had frightened faces. Soon the boss arrived and questioned the sole witness. The incident occurred in a dead zone, so there were no camera recordings. It turned out that the deceased's name was Jack. He had been sent to the warehouse to fetch welding equipment, but he hadn't returned. The witness went to look for him and found his body there. He didn't see anything suspicious. The situation worsened, and we contacted the base, where they also became concerned. They said they would send a helicopter with the necessary personnel tomorrow regardless of the fog. But that was not to be. The calm sea was replaced by a raging storm. All the workers hid in the inner compartments, afraid of being swept into the sea. I spent the whole day pondering my dream and the discovered body. Could my dream be true? What should I do? Because of the storm, we were trapped. My thoughts again turned to the coffin. I talked about it with Henry, telling him everything without hiding. At first, he didn't believe me, but as I recounted the story, his face began to show fear. After discussing everything, we decided to get rid of the coffin, just in case. Henry and I decided to act immediately after our shift despite the raging storm outside. Wearing the necessary storm-resistant suits, we stepped out of the relative safety of the indoor areas into the raging storm. Making our way to the hangar where the coffin was stored, every step was difficult. The wind blew so forcefully in our faces that it felt like we were walking against an invisible wall. Rain pelted our suits like thousands of needles, making every movement painful. Huge waves crashed against the platform, creating a menacing roar that drowned out our attempts to speak to each other. We had to shout to be heard even at arm's length. Reaching the hangar, we found the coffin where we had left it. It seemed even more ominous against the backdrop of the raging storm. Lifting it, we began clumsily making our way back to the edge of the platform. Every gust of wind made us stumble and lose our balance, and the waves crashing against the platform seemed eager to take it back into the sea. Reaching the edge, Henry and I tried to lift the coffin to throw it into the ocean, but the storm refused to abate, and each attempt was unsuccessful. The wind and water seemed to conspire against us, pushing it back onto the platform. We were on the verge of physical and emotional exhaustion, trying to hold on to the coffin, which in this storm seemed not just heavy but alive, as if something inside resisted its return to the sea. With each passing minute, the storm seemed more powerful, and Henry and I, summoning all our strength, made one final, determined attempt. With our combined efforts, using all our strength and willpower, we finally managed to move the coffin and throw it into the raging sea. Looking down, we saw dark waves swallow it up. Having done our deed, we headed back to the residential quarters. Upon arriving there, wet and exhausted but satisfied with our work, we returned to our rooms Was it finally over? But the storm outside continued to rage, and when it would end was unknown. At night, I dreamt fragments again. I briefly saw the old man who saved me. It seemed like he was trying to catch the right wave on the radio to reach me, but he couldn't. When I woke up, I felt shattered. After washing up, I headed to the mess hall. The storm was still raging outside. When I arrived, I saw that there was no one there. Where was everyone? I thought. Soon I saw someone running down the corridor. I called out to him, and he stopped with a frightened face, telling me that more deaths had occurred. I was surprised and ran with him. This time it happened in one of the residential rooms. 4 people were sleeping there, and they were all dead. The deaths occurred in the same way as before, with all their fluids drained, leaving only corpses. 2 doctors were examining the bodies, and one of them found a mark on the neck of one of the deceased. In the shape of a large circle, I remembered the creature from my dream. Could all this be true? The atmosphere on the platform became tense. No one was safe. As I stood examining the bodies, my radio turned on and Henry urgently told me to return as unforeseen circumstances had arisen. Without hesitation, I headed back there. When I arrived at the observation and communication post, I saw that everyone had tense faces. Henry told me that we had lost contact with the mainland. We were left here alone. A trap closed with a bang in my mind. What should we do? Leave the platform. We can't do that because special procedures and equipment are needed to shut down the well for conservation purposes. And right now it's running non-stop. If there's a leak, tons of oil will spill into the sea, causing an environmental disaster. On the other hand, some entity has settled here and is killing us one by one. No one knows what it is, but I'm increasingly convinced that my dream wasn't just imagination. As we stood discussing what to do, we suddenly heard a ringing, the same one we heard earlier. Everyone looked at each other in surprise. Mr. Blackwood asked if the coffin wasn't stored in the hangar, so I told him what had happened, how we threw it into the sea. But why? The boss asked, astonished. And I had to tell them everything. Everyone had shocked faces mixed with disbelief. I realized they didn't believe me. I wouldn't believe myself either. But what was happening here spoke otherwise. Mr. Blackwood came up to me and, putting his hand on my shoulder, told me to relax. Apparently recent events had taken a toll on me. I tried to object, pointing to the bodies and Bob, but he said there was a scientific explanation for everything. I gave up. Apparently they wouldn't believe it until they saw it with their own eyes. After that, I headed to my quarters. As I walked, the ringing continued. Because of the storm, we couldn't do anything. Going down now was akin to suicide. I lay down on the bed. The ringing prevented me from sleeping. It seemed like someone was banging a gong right next to my ear. But soon somehow I managed to fall asleep. I found myself in a room where the familiar old man sat. He was writing something, and when I wanted to ask him where I was, he put aside his notes, stood up, looked me in the eyes, then silently headed for the exit, indicating that I should follow him. We went outside, which resembled ancient Rome, but instead of crowded streets, there were corpses everywhere. They were all dried up. The old man headed to the right, and I followed, constantly looking around. What happened here, and where are we? Along the way, I saw rich architecture and beautiful statues. I became more convinced that I was in ancient Rome. The further we went, the more corpses we encountered. There was also more blood. It seemed the creature had been satiated and started killing just for fun. Soon we reached a slope with stairs. The old man started climbing up. It was high, and when we finally reached the top, I saw a huge throne where the man-monster from my dream was sitting. Around him were a huge number of corpses infested with thousands of those centipedes. It was such a disgusting scene that I almost vomited. It seemed this man was reveling in all this spectacle when suddenly an army of people started climbing the stairs behind me. Among them I noticed not only courageous heroes, but also old men and children, as well as women dressed in protective Roman armor. It seemed the entire human race had come out for the final battle. They stood facing the throne, looking at each other as if they were the deadliest enemies. Then a man emerged from the crowd. I recognized him. It was the same old man who brought me here, only younger. He raised his sword and, shouting something, rushed at the monster. His example was followed by others, shouting something, flags waving everywhere, the sound of thousands of feet stomping. But soon the slaughter began. Thousands of centipedes attacked the people, who in turn lit torches, setting them on fire. Soon the monster itself joined the battle, leaping off the throne, spreading its wings and taking off before diving down, killing one after another. It seemed like all was lost, but when I looked back, I saw hundreds of thousands more people climbing the stairs. It was indeed the final battle. People were dying, forming a huge pile. The centipedes were dwindling, but this vampire king seemed tireless. Sometimes, swooping down, he would grab a person and take off, then suck their blood before continuing the fight. There were still many people, but defeat seemed inevitable. Looking at the stairs, I saw that they were passing some heavy pitchers along a chain, filled with something and tightly sealed. I watched them, wondering what it was. When the pitchers reached the top, they began throwing them at the monster. They shattered, enveloping everything in black. It was oil. They continued to throw it. The creature had no idea what they were doing. They had previously extinguished all the torches and were waiting for something. More and more oil reached the top. They stopped throwing the pitchers and began piling them up into a mound. Then, when they were done, they started luring the creature toward it, and it took the bait. When the vampire flew into the crowd, a young man with a lit torch suddenly emerged from somewhere. Everything happened so fast. Then there was a huge explosion, and then a fire. I didn't feel the heat, but I saw everything around me starting to melt. Hundreds of people died on the spot. But the creature also suffered. Charred with limbs torn off, it lay on the ground. Then the surviving people rushed up and began stabbing it with pikes and slashing it with swords. But it still kept moving. Then the crowd parted, and they brought the familiar coffin to the top. Putting the creature inside, they chained the coffin and dragged it toward the sea. Suddenly the vision dispersed, and we found ourselves again in the same room where I appeared at the beginning. The old man was sitting with his back to me, writing something. I asked him what it was, but he turned to me silently, smiled, and struck the gong lying on his table. After that, I woke up. Lying in bed, drenched in sweat, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. Did they really show me the past? And that creature almost destroyed an entire civilization. What should I do? I got up and suddenly heard a noise. Opening the door, I saw a fleeing man screaming in terror. What was he running from? I quickly got dressed and headed outside. Upon entering the main hall, I noticed bodies lying everywhere. What the hell happened? Suddenly, I saw movement on one of the bodies and saw the creature crawling out of it. I took a step back and realized that these creatures had begun crawling from all sides. There were hundreds of them, and they were all crawling toward me. I turned around and ran. Fear paralyzed me, but I tried to think. I remembered that they were afraid of fire and headed toward the cafeteria. Running inside, I immediately ran to the kitchen. There, grabbing a gas cylinder, I disconnected it from the stove, leaving only the hose, and then grabbed some matches. Soon I found a lighter. These creatures were getting closer, and I stood ready. After opening the valve, I aimed the hose at these creatures and lit the fire. A stream of flames engulfed these centipedes, causing them to emit a nasty squeal that pierced to the bone. After dealing with them, I ran outside. Suddenly a siren sounded, and a voice announced an evacuation. Everyone was ordered to head to the lifeboats. Emerging outside, where the storm was raging, I noticed Henry, who was running toward me. I showed him the enclosed place, and we ran there, hiding from the storm. There I told him about the dream, and that we had to do something about that creature. Otherwise, humanity would be in danger. We didn't think for long, but decided to blow up this place. Fortunately, we knew how to do it, and the platform itself was one of the most explosive places. When we ran outside and headed to the drilling compartment, we saw the vampire flying in search of prey. Suddenly, he dived down and grabbed some poor soul. Because of the storm, we couldn't hear the screams, but we knew they were in danger. The ringing continued until now. Apparently, the coffin was still below. The storm raged with unabated fury. The wind whistled in our ears, and the rain beating on our faces resembled thousands of lashes. We could barely see each other through the thick veil of sea fog and rain, but our silhouettes served as guides to each other in this chaos. Suddenly, a shadow passed over us. The creature spotted us and, abandoning its prey, chased after us. Its eyes glowed like coals, and its teeth gleamed in the dim light of our flashlights. We ran, trying to keep our footing on the slippery metal platform, which seemed more like a roller rink than a reliable surface. With every gust of wind, we felt its breath, and with every rustle, its wings. Moving was extremely difficult. The storm made it hard to breathe, and the wind repeatedly tried to knock us off our feet. At one point, when we were very close to the drilling compartment, the creature made a sudden lunge forward, and its claws barely missed me. I felt its cold breath in the air. Henry, seeing the danger, shoved me aside sharply, and we fell onto the wet steel, sliding toward the compartment. Reaching the entrance, we struggled to close the door behind us, hearing the creature's wings beating against the metal. Now we were relatively safe, but there was no time for respite. But this peace turned out to be short-lived. The vampire, undeterred, began to batter the window of the drilling compartment. The sound of glass squealing under the brute force of the beast didn't bode well. At one moment, the glass couldn't hold, and with a roar, the creature burst inside. Instinctively, Henry and I dashed deeper into the compartment. The creature soared in the air, trying to catch up with us, but we were faster. Running into the corridor, we lured it after us and managed to lure it into one of the isolation chambers. Suddenly, veering to the right, the creature burst into the chamber after us and flew past. We jumped out at the last moment, slamming the door behind us. The vampire's momentary hesitation gave us the necessary advantage. We could hear it thrashing and scratching the metal inside the chamber, trying to break free. However, time was working against us. Moving quickly through the drilling compartment, we set up the drilling rig in such a way as to create excessive pressure in the system. We knew that this maneuver, although extremely dangerous, had to lead to a devastating explosion that would destroy the platform, and we hoped the creature along with it. All the settings were done, and the drill mechanism started its work, gradually increasing the pressure in the system. After completing the preparation, we rushed to the lifeboats. The storm was still raging outside. The sea's turmoil didn't abate, and every step toward salvation was heavy and risky. Battling the rain and wind, we made our way to the rescue station, hearing the increasing roar of the working drilling rig behind us. The sound of mounting pressure in the rig filled the air, like a harbinger of the impending explosion. We reached the lifeboats where Meister Blackwood was waiting for people, but apparently we were the last ones. We explained our plan to him, after which he shouted for everyone to get ready. Then we climbed into the orange lifeboat, which resembled a submarine. We were ready to depart when we saw one of the doctors running toward us, meaning someone else was still there. But suddenly he fell, and we noticed that many of those creatures were crawling on him, some of them crawling right into his ears. I grabbed the chief, who was staring at this scene in dismay, and dragged him into the rescue lifeboat. Pulling the lever, the lifeboat fell straight into the ocean when suddenly an explosion occurred. We were thrown, and the waves dragged us into the sea. Looking through a small window, I watched the platform burning and heard a horrifying scream coming from there. I don't know if we managed to kill that creature, but at least we did everything we could.